The sun was a hammer beating on the anvil of the earth. Out here, in the raw, unsettled territories of 1870, the land itself was a hostile creature. The ground was a mosaic of cracked mud and ochre dust, thirsty for a rain that never came. The wind was a restless spirit, whispering through skeletal sagebrush and whipping the red grit into the eyes of any living thing foolish enough to stand against it. High above, in a sky the color of faded denim, vultures scribed lazy, patient circles, their shadows drifting over the landscape like omens. It was in this unforgiving world that Marion existed, though she could not call it living. Her world had shrunk to the size of a splintered, heat-warped shack perched on the edge of a makeshift gold camp. The camp was a festering sore on the land, a collection of ragged tents and crude lean-tos populated by men with hollow eyes and greed-cankered souls. They clawed at the earth for yellow metal, their days fueled by cheap whiskey and simmering violence. Marion was just another one of their possessions. The shack belonged to a man who called himself her husband, but he was merely her keeper. He was a trafficker, a man who dealt in flesh and broken promises. Marion's past was a story she no longer told, a watercolor painting blurred by too many tears. She remembered green hills somewhere in the east, a home lost to poverty, and the slick words of a man who promised her a respectable marriage. That promise had turned into a clenched fist and a bill of sale. She had been passed from one brute to another until this last one dragged her west, a piece of property to be used and displayed. Her bridal dress, a simple white cotton thing her mother had sewn, had been torn from her long ago. Now, she wore a rough-spun shift that chafed her skin, a uniform of her servitude. From a rocky outcrop half a mile away, a pair of eyes the color of dark flint watched the camp. They belonged to Kohan. He was Apache, a hunter, a ghost who moved with the land, not upon it. The wind did not seem to bother him. It was an old acquaintance. The heat was a brother. He was a man whittled down to his very essence by loss. He had once had a family, a wife whose laughter was like the sound of a running stream, a son whose small hand had fit perfectly in his. They were gone now, swallowed by the insatiable hunger of the white man's expansion, their faces fading into memories that brought an ache as sharp and deep as a knife wound. Now, Kohan was alone. He hunted game to survive, but sometimes he hunted men, the kind who preyed on the weak, the kind who had shattered his world. He was a force of quiet, patient reckoning in a land that had forgotten justice. For 2 days, he had watched the camp. He'd been tracking a mountain lion, but the scent of human filth had drawn his attention. He saw the way the men looked at the woman in the shack, their eyes like hungry dogs. He saw the way her keeper dragged her by the arm, his voice a low growl of constant threats. Then, as the sun began its bloody descent, he witnessed the act that broke his hunter's stillness. The man was drunk. He stumbled from the shack, shouting, and dragged Marion out into the dying light. He struck her, a sharp, ugly sound that carried on the wind. She fell to her knees in the dust, and he kicked her. She made no sound, a silence that was more harrowing than any scream. He then hauled her back inside and through the open doorway. Kohan saw him take a length of rope and bind her wrists to a post in the center of the miserable dwelling. The man spat on the ground and lurched toward the camp's central fire, leaving her there, tethered like an animal. A cold stone settled in Kohan's gut. It was the familiar weight of a world out of balance. He did not feel rage, not in the hot, explosive way of the white men. He felt a deep, chilling purpose. He would wait. Patience was the Apache's greatest weapon. Night fell, blanketing the land in a profound darkness pricked by a million distant stars. The camp grew loud with drunken laughter and off-key singing. Then slowly, it succumbed to a stupor, one by one. The fires died down to glowing embers, when the only sounds were the yip of a distant coyote and the snoring of sated men. Kohan moved. He was a shadow detaching from other shadows. His moccasined feet made no sound on the rocky ground. He slipped between the tents, a phantom in the gloom, his senses alive to every shift in the air. He reached the shack. The keeper lay passed out near the entrance, a reek of whiskey rising from him like a foul mist. Kohan stepped over him without a glance. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. Marion was a pale shape in the dark, her head bowed. She flinched as he approached, a small, terrified movement. He put a finger to his lips. Though he had made no sound, her eyes, wide with fear in the faint starlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, were fixed on him. She saw the glint of a knife in his hand, and her body went rigid, bracing for a new violation. But the knife was not for her. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the rope that bound her wrists. The fibers parted with a soft hiss. He touched her arm, a brief, firm gesture. Asterisk, come. Asterisk. The command was unspoken but clear. For a moment, she hesitated, trapped between the devil she knew and this terrifying, silent stranger. But the memory of the kick, the rough bite of the rope, and the utter hopelessness of her future made the choice for her. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling. He led her out of the shack and into the vast, wild dark. Their escape was a flight through a nightmare. Kohan set a grueling pace, leading her away from the camp and into a landscape that seemed intent on destroying them. They passed through a forest that had been ravaged by fire months before. Skeletal, blackened trees clawed at a moonless sky, their stark silhouettes like the bones of dead giants. The ground was a carpet of ash and charcoal that puffed up around their feet in choking clouds. Marion stumbled constantly, her thin-soled shoes offering no protection against the sharp stones and roots that lay hidden beneath the soot. Once, she fell hard, her hand landing on a shard of rock. She cried out, a small, sharp gasp of pain, and when she looked at her palm, she saw a dark smear of blood. The sounds of the night pressed in on her. The wind moaned through the dead trees, and somewhere in the darkness, a pack of wolves began to howl, a long, mournful cry that spoke of hunger and the hunt. The sound went through Marion like a blade of ice. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a monster waiting to pounce. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She stumbled again, and this time she could not get up. She curled into a ball on the ashen ground, shaking uncontrollably, her silent endurance finally broken. Kohan stopped. He had not looked back once, but he had been aware of her every faltering step. He turned and stood over her, a tall, inscrutable figure against the stars. He did not speak, did not offer a hand. He simply waited. He waited for the wave of her terror to crest and break. When her ragged gasps subsided into shuddering sobs, he knelt. He took her bleeding hand. His own hands were calloused and hard, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. From a small pouch at his belt, he took a wad of dried leaves, crushed them between his fingers, and pressed the poultice against her cut. Then he tore a strip from the bottom of his own worn tunic and bound her palm. He did it all with an economy of motion, his focus absolute. He rose and pulled a worn buffalo hide from a roll on his back, laying it on the ground. He then produced a piece of dried jerky and a biscuit of hardtack, placing them beside her. It was a silent offering. Asterisk, rest, eat, survive. For 2 more days, they traveled. Kohan spoke no more than a dozen words, and only when necessary. Water. Here. Walk. But his actions spoke for him. He found clean water in a hidden spring. He pointed out the roots of a yucca plant she could chew for sustenance. At night, he would take the first watch, sitting motionless with his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, a guardian carved from the very stone of the mountain. Slowly, painstakingly, Marion's terror of him began to recede, replaced by a fragile, bewildered trust. He was not her captor. He was her rescuer. The realization was as frightening as it was liberating. On the 3rd morning, they crested a ridge, and below them, nestled in a shallow valley, lay a small town, It was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church. To Marion, it looked like paradise. It was civilization. It was safety. She turned to Kohan, her voice a dry rasp. "Thank you." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Please," she said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "Leave me here. Go back." Kohan's dark eyes studied her. He saw the fear in them, but it was a different fear now. It was not the fear of the wilderness, but of the world of men she was about to re-enter. "They will see you," she explained, her words tumbling out. "They will see a white woman with an Apache. They will ask questions. They will think. They will not understand. It will be dangerous for you, and for me." She understood the brutal arithmetic of this land. A lone woman was a victim. A woman with a native was a pariah. Or worse, her freedom was a delicate, newborn thing, and it would be crushed by the weight of prejudice before it could even draw its first breath. Kohan looked from her pale, earnest face to the town below. He saw not a paradise, but a cage of a different sort, one with invisible bars of suspicion and hatred. He understood her logic completely. In this world, his presence was a brand upon her. To truly set her free, he had to disappear. Without a word, he unslung his water skin and handed it to her. It was still half full. Then, he turned and walked back the way they had come. He did not look back. He simply melted into the rocks and the sagebrush, becoming one with the shadows he was born from, leaving Marion standing alone on the ridge. A ghost of a bride caught between two worlds. The town of redemption was not named for salvation, but for the hard currency used to buy a man's claim. It was a single, wide artery of dust, lined with false-fronted buildings that slumped in the oppressive heat. As Marion walked into its meager civilization, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. A woman alone was a curiosity, a problem, or an opportunity. She pulled the worn buffalo hide tighter around her shoulders, a talisman from a world of silent honor she had just left, and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. She invented a story as she walked, a widow from a wagon train, her husband taken by fever, her belongings lost in a river crossing. It was a thin, common lie, but it was all she had. Her inquiries for work led her to one name, spoken with a mixture of respect and fear: Jack Calder. His ranch, the Triple C, was the largest in the valley, a small kingdom of cattle and horses. They said he was a hard man, a man who had buried his wife 2 years prior and had buried his heart along with her. They said he didn't tolerate fools or idlers. He sounded terrifying. He sounded safe. The Calder ranch house was a solid, 2-story structure made of thick timber, built to withstand blizzards and sieges. It was a fortress against the wilderness. Marion knocked on the heavy oak door, her knuckles barely making a sound. The man who answered filled the entire frame. Jack Calder was taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and sun-etched lines, dominated by pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing and approve of less. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and remote. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of impatience. "What do you want?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant rockfall. "I'm looking for work, sir," Marion said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I can cook, I can clean, mend, anything you need." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've got a half-dozen ranch hands who can burn bacon and boil coffee. Don't need another." He started to close the door. Desperation gave her courage. "Please, sir, my hand was injured, but it's healing. I work hard. I don't ask for much. Just a roof and meals." She held up her bandaged hand, the one Kohan had tended. Jack's cold gaze dropped to her hand, then flickered over her face. He saw the grime and the exhaustion, but he also saw something else in her eyes. It wasn't the cunning of a grifter or the emptiness of a saloon girl. It was the haunted, steady gaze of a survivor, an honesty that couldn't be faked. He saw the raw, red skin of rope burns on her wrists, peeking from beneath the hide wrap. He paused. The door held half open. "I have one rule on my ranch," he said slowly, his voice flat and hard. "You do your work, you keep to yourself. No questions asked of me, and no requests made. You take what you're given and you earn it. You understand?" "Yes, sir," she breathed, relief making her dizzy. "Rooms in the back, off the kitchen. Work starts before the sun comes up. The hands eat at dawn, noon, and dusk. Don't be late." He stepped back, allowing her to enter, and closed the door behind her. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a cell door locking. Life on the Triple C fell into a rhythm, a steady, predictable beat that was a balm to Marian's fractured soul. She rose in the pre-dawn chill, the world still painted in shades of gray and purple. The first thing she did was build up the fire in the big iron stove, its warmth a welcome comfort. She learned the simple alchemy of a ranch kitchen, turning flour, lard, and water into biscuits, brewing coffee thick and black enough to float a horseshoe, frying slabs of bacon and mountains of eggs. The sounds of the ranch became her clock, the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of men's voices, the snort and stamp of horses. From the kitchen window, she would watch Jack Calder. He moved with an unyielding authority, a man in complete command of his domain. She saw him break a wild colt, not with brutality, but with an iron will and an almost imperceptible gentleness that seemed at odds with his harsh demeanor. He was a demanding teacher to his cowboys, his voice cutting across the dusty corral with sharp, precise commands. He was a man made of the same tough, unyielding material as the land he had conquered. He rarely spoke to her, a curt nod in the morning, a grunt of approval if the stew was to his liking. He was a wall of silence, his emotions locked away behind a door to which he had long ago lost the key. Marian learned he'd had a wife, Elspeth. Her ghost lived in the profound silence of the main house, in the faded needlepoint pillows on the parlor sofa, in the rose bushes she had planted near the porch, now tangled and overgrown. The men never mentioned her name. The past was a locked room, and Marian knew better than to knock. She never spoke of Kohan. His name was a secret she held in the quietest part of her heart. But every morning, when she baked the day's bread, she would break off a small piece from the first loaf, the one with the softest center, and wrap it in a piece of cloth. She kept it in the pocket of her apron, a silent offering, a piece of communion for the man who had saved her. It was a ritual of gratitude, a private acknowledgement of the debt she could never repay. One night, weeks after her arrival, the autumn air turned sharp with the promise of an early frost. The cattle had been brought in from the high pastures, and the men were in a boisterous mood. Jack had opened a bottle of whiskey, and the sound of their rough laughter carried into the kitchen where Marian was cleaning up. It was late when they finally stumbled off to the bunkhouse. Jack remained in the main room, slumped in his armchair, the bottle still in his hand. Marian finished her work and, driven by a tidiness that was second nature, she made a tour of the quiet house. She entered the master bedroom upstairs to turn down the bed, a chore she had never been explicitly told to do, but which she assumed was part of her duties. The room was heavy with disuse, dust motes dancing in the single beam of moonlight from the window. It was a shrine to his dead wife. A silver-backed brush lay on the vanity, a few long, fair hairs still caught in its bristles. The bed was covered with a heavy, intricate quilt of her making. As Marian pulled back the quilt, a floorboard creaked in the doorway. Jack stood there, swaying slightly, his face a thunderous mask in the shadows. The cold blue of his eyes had turned dark and stormy. "What are you doing?" he growled, the words slurred with whiskey and a raw, ragged grief. I was just turning down the bed, sir," she stammered, her hands freezing on the quilt. "Get out!" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "I said, get out!" he roared, taking a staggering step into the room. "This is her room. You have no right to be in here. You have no right to touch her things." His rage was a physical force, sucking the air from the room. Marion backed away, her heart pounding. She was no longer a paid cook. She was a trespasser, a vulnerable woman cornered by a large, angry man. All her old fears came rushing back. "You think because you're here, you can just take her place?" he snarled, his voice thick with a pain that was sharper than anger. He gestured wildly around the room. "She built this house with me. She wasn't some piece of baggage left on the side of the road. She wasn't a cast-off woman nobody wanted." The word struck Marion with the force of a physical blow. Asterisk cast-off woman. It was the name she had secretly called herself. It was the truth she had been running from. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp. She turned and fled, past him, down the stairs, and out of the house. She didn't stop at her small room. She ran, heedless of the cold, toward the main barn. She had to leave. This place wasn't safe. No place was safe. As she ran, the sky opened up. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the dusty yard into a slick, greasy mud. The wind howled, tearing at her thin dress. She reached the barn, her breath sobbing in her chest, and collapsed onto a pile of hay just inside the great doors. The world tilted and went dark. The weeks of fear, the flight, the fragile peace she had found, it all crumbled at once. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, simply gave up. Inside the house, Jack's drunken fury had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter dregs of shame. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his wife's bed, and put his head in his hands. The things he had said were cruel, unforgivable. He had taken his own poisoned grief and used it as a weapon against a woman who had shown him nothing but quiet diligence. The sound of the rising storm finally penetrated his stupor. He knew she had run out into it with nothing but the thin dress she wore. A cold dread, colder than the autumn rain, seeped into his bones. He found her in the barn, a pale, still heap in the damp hay, her face like wax in the lantern light. The rain had plastered her dress to her body, and she was shivering violently even in her unconscious state. Remorse, sharp and unfamiliar, twisted in his gut. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her back to the house, not to her small room, but up the stairs and into his, the one he had just chased her from. He laid her gently on the bed, on top of the very quilt she had tried to turn down. He needed to get her out of the wet clothes before a fever took her. With fumbling, unaccustomed hands, he began to unbutton the back of her simple cotton dress. As he peeled the damp fabric away from her skin, he froze. The lantern light cast a flickering glow across her back, and what he saw made the breath catch in his throat. It was a map of a life of pain, from her shoulders to her waist. Her skin was a network of old scars. Some were thin, white lines, faded with time. Others were thicker, angry welts that spoke of more recent and repeated cruelty. They crisscrossed her back in a brutal, deliberate pattern, a testament to a suffering so profound he could not begin to comprehend it. This was not the result of an accident. This was the work of a monster. He stood there for a long moment, the wet dress in his hand, the storm raging outside, the unconscious woman on his bed. And in that moment, Jack Calder saw Marion for the first time. Not as a cook, not as a trespasser, not as a cast-off woman, but as a survivor of a private, hellish war he knew nothing about. The walls around his heart did not crumble, but for the first time in 2 years, a crack appeared. Marion awoke in a bed that was not hers, the scent of lavender and old cedar filling her senses. The storm had passed. Sunlight, clean and sharp, streamed through the window. For a moment, she was lost, her mind a fog of fear and confusion. Then it came back to her. The confrontation, the whiskey on his breath, the cruel words, the flight into the rain. She sat up, realizing she was wearing one of Jack's own shirts, a coarse wool garment that swallowed her small frame. Her wet dress was gone. Her back, for the first time in as long as she could remember, was bare to the air in the room. A flush of shame and fear washed over her. Jack Calder was not in the room. He was not in the house. When Marion crept downstairs, she found a bowl of porridge warming on the stove and a fresh cup of coffee waiting. There was no note, no word of explanation. The man himself was a void, a heavy silence that filled the house. The silence lasted for 3 days. He took his meals with the hands in the bunkhouse, returning to the main house only late at night after she had retired to her small room off the kitchen. He did not speak to her. He barely looked at her. But something had changed. The cold indifference in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something guarded and unreadable. He was a man wrestling with a ghost, and Marion did not know if the ghost was his dead wife, or the one he had just discovered she carried within herself. On the 4th day, he began to build just after dawn. Marion heard the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. She looked out the kitchen window and saw Jack, his sleeves rolled up to his powerful biceps, felling a stand of young pines at the edge of the yard. For the next 2 weeks, he worked with a relentless, single-minded focus. He did not ask for help. He squared the logs, notched them with practiced precision, and single-handedly raised the walls of a small cabin, no bigger than a single room, 100 feet from the main house. He was a man who spoke with his hands. This cabin was his apology. It was his admission of wrongdoing, his act of contrition carved from solid wood. When it was finished, he built a simple bed frame inside, a small table, and a hearth for a stove. He moved her meager belongings into it himself. He still did not speak of the night of the storm, but when he finally met her gaze across the yard, he simply said, "This is yours. You'll have your privacy here." It was more than he had said to her in a month. Marion moved into the cabin, and it became her sanctuary. It was the first space in her entire life that belonged only to her. She could bolt the door at night and know that no one would enter. This small act of security was a freedom more profound than any she had yet known. Her life on the ranch expanded beyond the kitchen. The hands, who had witnessed the silent, tense drama, began to treat her with a new kind of deference. They saw the quiet resilience in her, the way she never complained, the way she moved with a purpose that seemed to defy the haunted look in her eyes. They saw the way their boss, the formidable Jack Calder, watched her from a distance. They started bringing her small gifts, a clutch of prairie flowers, a strangely shaped stone, a feather from a hawk's wing. She was no longer just the cook. She was becoming a part of the rough fabric of the Triple C. One afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the plains, Marion was outside, hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. A flicker of movement at the edge of the property, where the rolling grasslands met the dark line of the distant mountains, caught her eye. It was Kohan. He sat on his horse, as still as the rocks around him, a figure belonging more to the land itself than to the world of men. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but she felt his gaze on her. A silent question. Asterisk. Are you safe? Are you well? Her heart gave a painful lurch, a complex knot of gratitude, fear, and a strange sense of loss. He was the beginning of her freedom, a ghost from a life she had already left behind. The kitchen door of the main house slammed open. Jack Calder stood on the porch, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, were fixed on the distant rider. "Get back inside, Marion," he said, his voice a low, dangerous command. "He's not here to cause trouble," she said, turning to face Jack, her hands still clutching a wet bedsheet. "I don't care what he's here for," Jack bit out, his knuckles white on the rifle. "His kind aren't welcome on my land. I see a redskin that close to my home. I shoot first." The raw prejudice in his voice was like a slap. "No!" Marion stepped forward, placing herself between Jack and the distant figure of Kohan. "He is the man who saved me." The words hung in the air between them. Jack's gaze shifted from the rider to her, his expression hardening with a possessive fire she didn't understand. He looked at her, standing there defending the Apache, and the silence stretched, taut and volatile. He had seen the scars, but he had not known the story. Now, a piece of it stood on his horizon, and it infuriated him. From the distance, Kohan raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. It was not a wave, but a sign of acknowledgement, of peace. Then, he turned his horse and melted back into the landscape, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. Jack lowered his rifle, but the tension remained in his shoulders. "Stay away from him," he ordered, his voice rough. "Your life is here now." He turned and went back into the house without another word. The next morning, tied to the post of the clothesline, was a small, deerskin string. On it were threaded 3 smooth, dark stones etched with faint, ancient symbols. It was a necklace, a piece of the old world, the Apache world, Kohan's world. Marion knew what it was instantly. A farewell, a blessing. He was severing the final tie, leaving her to her new life. She clutched the stones in her hand, their coolness a strange comfort, and a profound loneliness washed over her. She was standing between 2 men, 2 worlds. One was the wild, silent man who had cut the ropes from her wrists and asked for nothing in return. He had given her life. The other was the brooding, tormented man who made her heart thunder in her chest with a single look. He had given her a home, a fragile sanctuary. Kohan was her past, the symbol of a brutal freedom won in darkness and flight. Jack was her present, a terrifying and magnetic hope for a future she never thought she'd have. The space between them was a chasm, and she was stranded in the middle. With the illusion of safety came the return of the ghosts. Her sleep was no longer a peaceful escape. The nightmares came back, more vivid than ever. She would dream she was back in the shack, the rope biting into her skin, the stench of her keeper's breath hot on her face. Sometimes, she was on an auction block in a crowded, smoky room, men's hands grabbing at her, their voices bidding for her as if she were livestock. She would wake up in her small, safe cabin, her heart hammering, the scream trapped in her throat, the phantom feel of chains on her limbs. The scars on her back would ache as if they were fresh wounds. Winter arrived, blanketing the prairie in a pristine, silent layer of snow. The world became smaller, quieter. The cold was a constant, biting presence. One night, the temperature plummeted, and a fierce wind howled around the corners of the main house. Marion couldn't sleep. The ghosts were too loud. She pulled a shawl over her nightgown and left the warmth of her cabin. Walking through the deep snow to the main house, the kitchen would be warm. She would sit by the stove until the dreams faded. As she entered, she saw a faint light from the main parlor. Jack was sitting in his armchair by the hearth, the embers of the fire casting a dull, red glow on his face. He wasn't drinking. He was just sitting there, staring into the dying flames, a man lost in his own winter. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She shook her head, pulling the shawl tighter. She intended to just pass through to the kitchen, but she found herself stopping, held in place by his gaze. "What is it, Marion?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "What troubles you?" The quiet sympathy in his voice, so unexpected, unraveled her. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. She sank to the floor, sitting on the hearth rug not far from his chair, and hugged her knees to her chest, the sobs she had held back for so long finally shaking her body. Jack did not move. He did not touch her. He simply sat and watched her, giving her the space to let the grief pour out. When her sobs finally subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the firelight. "He saved me," she whispered, her voice raw. "He cut the rope. He led me through the dark. But I'm not free." She looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if she could still see the phantom marks on her wrists. "Even though I'm free," she said, her voice filled with a lifetime of sorrow. "I'm still in chains." The fire popped, spitting a shower of orange sparks onto the hearthstones. In the flickering light, Marion's face was a pale oval, her eyes dark pools reflecting the dying flames. The story did not come out in a torrent of tears, but in a low, steady voice, as if she were reciting a catechism of sorrows she had learned by heart. "I was 16, she began, her gaze fixed on the fire. "My father's farm had failed. There was a man from back east, a merchant. He seemed respectable. He offered my father a sum of money that could save our home. In exchange, I was to be his bride." She paused, a small, bitter smile touching her lips. It wasn't a marriage. It was a purchase. The bill of sale was signed before the preacher said his words. Jack sat as still as a stone effigy in his chair. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just listened. "He was not a kind man," she continued, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "He believed a wife was property, like a good horse or a milk cow, something to be worked, used, and corrected when it displeased him. The corrections were frequent." She didn't need to describe the methods. The scars on her back had already told that story. "When he tired of me, or perhaps when his business soured, he sold me again, to a trapper heading west. I was part of the price for a wagon and supplies. The trapper lost me in a card game to another man, who then brought me to that mining camp. Each time, the price got lower. Each time, a piece of me vanished. I learned to be quiet, to be invisible. I learned that my body was not my own. The chain you saw wasn't the first. It was just the one I couldn't break on my own." She fell silent. The only sound in the room was the sigh of the wind outside and the crackle of the embers. The story was told. She had laid the broken pieces of her life on the hearth between them. She did not look at him, bracing herself for the disgust, the pity, the revulsion she expected. Jack finally moved. He leaned forward, his large hands resting on his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, harder. When he spoke, his voice was a rough, gravelly thing, an instrument unaccustomed to the notes of tenderness. "I am sorry," he said. The words were clumsy, inadequate. He cleared his throat. "That night, in my wife's room, what I said to you..." He stopped, searching for the right words and finding none. He settled for the blunt, unvarnished truth. "If I say the wrong thing, it's because I don't know what to do with a woman like you, a woman who has been through that." He wasn't saying he didn't know what to do with a broken woman. He was saying he didn't know what to do with a woman who had endured the unendurable and was still sitting here, breathing, living. It was an admission of awe, a confession of his own emotional ineptitude. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. That night, something shifted between them. The space was no longer filled with tension and unspoken rules, but with a fragile, shared understanding. The silence was no longer a wall, but a quiet space they could inhabit together. They began to exist in the same orbit. He would find reasons to be in the kitchen when she was there, checking a ledger or mending a piece of tack. She would look out her cabin window and see him watching the house, a silent, brooding guardian. A few weeks later, the first heavy snow of the season fell. It came down in thick, silent flakes, burying the ranch in a blanket of pristine white. The world shrank to the confines of the Triple C. The cold was bone-deep and relentless. That night, unable to sleep, Marion went to the main house kitchen. The act of baking had become her solace, the methodical kneading of dough a way to work the knots out of her soul. Soon, the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen, a scent of life and comfort in the frozen world. The back door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and a blast of frigid air. Jack stood there, covered in white, having just come from a late-night check of the calving barn. He stamped the snow from his boots, his face red with cold, his breath pluming in the warm air. "Smells good," he rumbled, his voice low. "It'll be ready soon," she said softly, not looking up from the loaf she was pulling from the oven. He walked over to the stove, drawn by its heat, and held his half-frozen hands out to the warmth. He stood beside her, closer than he had ever stood before. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the cold, clean scent of snow and leather on him. She placed the hot loaf on a wooden board to cool and began to slice it. Steam rose from the cut, carrying the scent of home. "Here," she said, holding out the first heel slice to him. He reached for it. His cold, rough fingers brushed against hers. It was a brief, accidental touch, skin against skin, but a jolt went through them both, as sharp and sudden as a static spark. It was the first time they had touched. Marion snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. Jack froze, the slice of bread halfway to his mouth. Their eyes met. For a long, breathless moment, the world stopped. There was nothing but the sound of the wind, the warmth of the stove, and the terrifying, undeniable current that flowed between them. In his eyes, she saw not the hard rancher, but a man of profound loneliness. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but a woman of astonishing strength, with a flicker of a desire she thought had been beaten out of her long ago. Then, the moment broke. Fear, the old, familiar instinct, slammed back into place for both of them. Marion turned away abruptly, her heart hammering, her face flushed. She was a damaged thing, a piece of property. What right did she have to feel this? Jack took a step back, his own expression shuddering, the mask of the cold, unfeeling rancher falling back into place. He was a man who had sworn off feeling, who had buried his heart with his wife. This spark was a betrayal, a danger he couldn't afford. He muttered a gruff, "Thank you," and left the kitchen, taking the bread with him. Marion was left alone with the warmth of the stove and the echoing thunder of her own pulse. But the spark, once lit, could not be entirely extinguished. The next morning, Marion found herself smiling as she watched the hands bicker over breakfast. It was a small, real smile, one that reached her eyes. Later that day, she looked out her window and saw Jack driving new posts into the frozen ground around her cabin. He was building a small picket fence, a decorative, almost absurdly domestic barrier in the vast, wild landscape. It wasn't a fence to keep things out. The Triple C was already miles from anywhere. It was a symbolic thing. It was his way of saying, "Asterisk, this space is yours. It is safe. I will keep it that way." The snow melted, and as the valley thawed, word of the new arrangement on the Triple C trickled into the town of Redemption. Gossip, like spring runoff, finds its own channels. The talk started as whispers in the general store, as murmurs over the bar in the saloon. Asterisk, that Calder fellow, got himself a woman out at his place. Asterisk heard she just walked in off the prairie. No family, no name. Asterisk a runaway. I'd wager, maybe a whore from one of the mining camps. The story grew with each telling. Marion became a mysterious, fallen woman. Jack, the grieving, respectable widower, became a fool, or worse, a man living in sin. The women of the town, in particular, clutched their Bibles and their reputations, viewing Marion as a threat to the fragile social order. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up to the main house. It was not a ranch wagon. It carried Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the general store and a deacon at the church, and his severe-faced wife. They represented the moral spine of the town. Jack met them on the porch, his face impassive. Marion watched from the window of her cabin, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "Calder," Abernathy began, twisting his hat in his hands. "The missus and I, well, the town is concerned." "Concerned about what, Abernathy?" Jack's voice was flat. "Mrs.?" Abernathy spoke up, her voice thin and sharp. It is about the woman you are keeping here. It is not proper. A widower of your standing, and a woman of her unknown background. People are talking. It sets a bad example." "What I do on my own land is my business," Jack said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "It becomes the town's business when it involves decency," Abernathy insisted, emboldened by his wife. "We are a good, God-fearing community. We cannot abide such arrangements. For her own good, and for the good of your name, you need to solve this problem. You need to send her on her way." Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The veins on his neck stood out. He took a step forward, and the Abernathys, seeing the thunderhead of rage gathering on his face, took an involuntary step back. "The only problem I have right now," Jack growled, his voice a low tremor of restrained violence, "is you standing on my porch telling me how to live my life. Now get off my land before I solve that asterisk problem for you." The Abernathys scrambled into their wagon and fled, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation in their wake. Jack stood on the porch, a pillar of thunderous silence, until the wagon was a speck in the distance. Then he turned, his movement stiff with fury, and stalked back into the house. Marion, watching from her cabin, saw the door slam shut with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations. A moment later, a sickening crash echoed from within, the sound of his fist meeting the heavy oak of the dining table. "Damn them all to hell!" His voice, a raw, ragged roar, carried across the yard. "Damn their pious meddling hides!" Marion's blood ran cold. She had brought this trouble. Her presence was a stain on his name, a blight on his house. She was the source of the town's gossip, the cause of his rage, the familiar, sickening feeling of being a burden, a problem to be solved, washed over her. "They want a solution?" he bellowed to the empty house. "Is that what they want? Fine, I'll give them a solution." There was a sound of a chair scraping violently across the floor. "I'll marry her. I'll put my name on her and make her the mistress of this ranch. Then let's see one of those sanctimonious bastards call the wife of Jack Calder improper." The word struck Marion like a physical blow. Marry. It was not a promise of love. It was a brand, a title of ownership. It was the same word the merchant had used, the same cage her father had sold her into. In her world, marriage was not a sanctuary. It was a contract of servitude, a bill of sale sanctified by a preacher. Jack's declaration, born of rage and a fierce, protective pride she couldn't comprehend, sounded to her like the clang of a prison gate. He wasn't offering her a heart. He was offering her a chain, gilded with his name. Panic, primal and absolute, seized her. She couldn't breathe. The walls of her small, safe cabin suddenly felt like they were closing in. She had to run. She didn't think about where. She just knew she couldn't stay. She burst out the door and ran, not toward the town, but away from it, away from the house, away from the man who had just unknowingly threatened her with the one thing she feared more than anything else. She fled toward the only place that had ever offered her a semblance of anonymous freedom, the wilderness. She ran into the tangled woods that bordered the ranch, her breath tearing at her lungs, branches whipping at her face. Tears streamed from her eyes, blurring the trees into a green and brown prison. She ran until the sounds of the ranch faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pines. She finally stumbled to a halt in a small, secluded clearing, her chest heaving, her mind a maelstrom of terror. Well, look what the wind blew in." The voice was greasy, familiar. It slithered out from the trees behind her. Marion froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. She turned slowly. Two men stepped out of the shadows. They were from the mining camp. One was a hulking, bearded man with small, cruel eyes named Silas. The other was wiry and weasel-faced, the one who had held the rope the night her keeper had tied her up. "We heard there was a stray filly over at the Calder place," Silas sneered, his gaze crawling over her. "Figured it had to be you. You ran out on us, little bird. That wasn't very polite." "I don't have anything," Marion stammered, backing away. "I didn't take anything." "Oh, we know," the weasel-faced man said with a gap-toothed grin. "But you cost our boss a piece of property. And you left with that red skin, made us look like fools. The boss wants to have a long talk with you about it." They started to advance on her, circling her like wolves. Marion's panicked flight had led her from a perceived cage straight into the jaws of a real one. She looked wildly around for an escape, but there was none. Her past had caught her. Silas lunged, grabbing her arm in a crushing grip. Marion screamed, a raw, desperate sound that was swallowed by the indifferent woods. She fought, kicking and scratching with a feral strength born of terror. But it was useless. The second man grabbed her other arm, and together they began to drag her deeper into the trees. And then, a shadow detached from the trees. It happened so fast it was almost surreal. One moment, the men were dragging her. The next, the weasel-faced man let out a choked, gurgling sound, and his grip on her arm went slack. He stared down in disbelief at the haft of a knife protruding from his chest, a dark stain blossoming around it on his filthy shirt. He crumpled to the ground without another sound. Silas bellowed in rage and surprise, dropping Marion to draw the pistol from his belt. He never cleared the holster. Kohan was on him, a silent, fluid blur of motion. There was no battle cry, no warrior's yell. There was only the sound of a heavy thud, as the stone head of a tomahawk met Silas's temple with sickening force. The big man dropped like a felled ox. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The clearing was suddenly profoundly silent, except for the drip of blood from a pine needle onto the forest floor. Kohan stood over the bodies, his chest rising and falling with his controlled breaths. He turned to look at Marion. His face, usually so impassive, was a mask of cold, lethal purpose. Marion stared, her mind unable to process the violence she had just witnessed. The sight of the dead men, the smell of fresh blood, the terrifying finality of it all, crashed down on her. This had happened because of her. These men were dead because she existed. The blood that splattered the front of her dress felt like it was her own. She backed away from Kohan, from the bodies, from the entire horrific scene, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that was part horror, part grief. He had saved her again. But this time, the price was blood, and it was a price that felt too high to bear. She turned and ran again, a new kind of terror propelling her. She ran back the way she came, stumbling, falling, her mind screaming. She didn't stop until she broke through the tree line and saw the familiar shapes of the ranch house and her small cabin. Jack was in the yard, his face a mask of frantic worry. He had seen her run and had been about to go after her. He saw her emerge from the woods, her dress torn, her face ashen and spattered with crimson. His own anger and fear vanished, replaced by a primal, protective instinct. He crossed the distance between them in a few long strides. "Marion, what happened? Are you hurt?" He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injury. She stared up at him, her eyes wide and vacant with shock. She shook her head, unable to form words. She was drowning in the horror of what she'd seen. He saw the blood on her dress then, and realized it wasn't hers. A dark, cold understanding dawned in his eyes. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The world he had tried to keep at bay had found her. He pulled her against him, crushing her in a fierce embrace, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. He held her as the first shuddering sobs began to rack her body. "It's over," he murmured into her hair, his voice a rough, unsteady thing. "It's all over now." He held her away from him, his hands gripping her upper arms, forcing her to look at him. His blue eyes burned with a fire she had never seen before. "Listen to me. You don't have to save yourself anymore. That's my job now." That night, the unspoken thing that had sparked and smoldered between them finally ignited. He brought her into the main house, into his room, and sat with her by the fire as the shock slowly receded. Words were useless. The barriers of fear and propriety had been washed away by blood and terror. All that was left was a man and a woman, stripped bare to their essential, lonely souls. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb wiping away a tear. It was a question. She leaned into his touch, a silent answer. He led her to the bed, and in the soft, flickering light of the fire, they came together. It was not an act of frantic passion, but of slow, tender discovery. Every touch was hesitant, gentle, a reverence paid to a sacred, wounded thing. When he unbuttoned her dress, the one stained with the blood of her past, he did so with the care of a man unwrapping a fragile gift. He peeled it away, and when he saw the scars that mapped her back, he didn't flinch. Marion began to cry, silent tears of a pain and a release so profound it had no voice. She was ashamed, terrified of his rejection. But Jack simply lowered his head and pressed his lips to the first raised welt on her shoulder. He kissed it, and then the next one, and the next. He traced the brutal history written on her skin not with pity, but with a worshipping tenderness. He was not just taking a lover, he was healing a soul. He was kissing away the shame, erasing the brand of property, and claiming her not as a possession, but as a person, in his arms, held with a strength that was gentle for the first time in her life. Marion finally let the last chain break. In the aftermath of the storm, a season of profound peace settled over the Triple C Ranch. The violence in the woods had acted as a brutal cauterization, burning away the last of the infected wounds of their pasts. Marion and Jack began to live not as a boss and his cook, or a protector and his ward, but as a man and a woman building a life together. They were not yet married in the eyes of the law or the church, but in the quiet, unspoken ways that mattered. They were husband and wife. Their days were a tapestry woven from the threads of shared work. He taught her how to mend a section of roof that the winter winds had loosened, their hands often brushing as they passed shingles and nails. She worked alongside him in the barn, her fear of the large animals slowly giving way to a quiet confidence. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a team, when a cunning fox tried to raid the chicken coop, their combined shouts and waving arms sending the creatures scurrying back into the brush. They spread manure in the small garden Elspeth had once tended, the earthy, honest work grounding them, connecting them to the cycles of the land. When summer thunderstorms rolled across the prairie, cracking the sky with lightning and sound, they would light a fire in the hearth and sit together, his quiet strength a bulwark against the roaring chaos outside. The haunted look in Marion's eyes began to recede, replaced by a light that Jack had never seen before. She started to laugh, at first a small, hesitant sound, but it grew into a full, warm expression of joy that seemed to brighten the very air in the house. The ranch hands, seeing the profound change in their boss and the woman who had brought life back to his home, treated her with a fierce, familial loyalty. It was Jack who insisted she learn to ride. "This is your land, too," he told her one morning, leading a gentle, steady mare into the corral. "You need to know how to cross it." At first, she was terrified. The height and power of the animal a frightening reminder of her own powerlessness. But Jack's patience was infinite. He held the reins, his voice a low, calming murmur, his hand a steady presence on her back. He taught her balance, taught her to trust the animal, and in doing so, taught her to trust herself. Soon, she was riding alongside him, her hair flying free in the wind, a smile on her face. To see her galloping across the open grassland was to see a woman who had finally learned the true meaning of freedom. She was no longer running from something. She was riding toward a future. Their peace was so complete, so profound, that when it was shattered, the sound was deafening. It happened on a blistering hot afternoon in late summer. A smart, black buggy, the kind rarely seen west of the Mississippi, rolled up the long track to the ranch house. It was pulled by two perfectly matched bays, a stark contrast to the dusty, hard-working cow ponies of the ranch. 3 men, dressed in dark, formal suits that were utterly unsuited for the climate. stepped out. Two were large, imposing figures with the hard, blank faces of hired muscle. The third man was slender, with a pale, narrow face, thin lips, and cold, calculating eyes. He held a piece of paper in his hand as if it were a weapon. Marion was on the porch, mending one of Jack's shirts, when she saw them. As the slender man's eyes fell on her, a jolt of ice-cold recognition shot through her. Time rewound. She was 16 again, standing in her father's failing farmhouse. It was him, Elias Thorne, the merchant, her first owner, her legal, documented husband. The world tilted on its axis. The needle fell from her numb fingers. The peaceful, sun-drenched porch became the cold, hard floor of a cage. The real chains, the ones made of paper and law, had found her at last. Jack came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. He saw the buggy, the men in their city clothes, and the look of pure, soul-deep terror on Marion's face. His demeanor changed instantly. The calm rancher vanished, replaced by a dangerous, coiled stillness. "I am Elias Thorne," the man said, his voice crisp and devoid of emotion. He did not look at Jack, but kept his cold eyes fixed on Marion. "And I have come to collect my wife." He held up the paper. It was a marriage certificate, stamped and official. "This document, recognized by the laws of this nation, confirms that this woman, Marion Thorne, is my legal and rightful spouse. She absconded from my home 2 years ago. I am here to escort her back." Marion couldn't breathe. It was happening. The nightmare she had pushed to the deepest recesses of her mind was standing on her porch. She was property. The law said so. All the peace, all the love, all the healing of the past months was a fantasy, an illusion. This was reality. "She's not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice a low growl. He began to walk slowly toward the porch, placing himself between Thorne and Marion. Thorne finally deigned to look at Jack, a faint, dismissive sneer on his lips. "You are mistaken, my good man. This is a legal matter. She is my property. Interfering would be unwise. My associates are here to ensure a smooth transition." The two brutes shifted their weight, their hands suggestively close to the pistols holstered beneath their coats. "The only thing you'll be escorting is yourself off my land," Jack said, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "Or I'll see you buried in it." Marion let out a small, choked cry. "Jack, no! He has the paper! It's the law!" To her, the law was an absolute, terrifying force. It was the thing that had allowed her to be sold in the first place. "I don't give a damn about his paper," Jack snarled, his eyes blazing with a murderous light. He had not fought to save her soul, only to lose her to a piece of paper. He began to draw his gun. "That would be a mistake." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. All 6 people in the yard froze. Kohan stepped out from the corner of the barn. He moved with a supernatural silence, a ghost of the prairie appearing in the harsh afternoon sun. He was not armed for a fight. His rifle was not in his hands. He simply stood there, his dark eyes fixed on Elias Thorne. Thorne and his men stared, momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance of the Apache warrior. It was Jack who broke the silence, his voice tight with confusion. "Kohan." Kohan did not look at him. He walked slowly forward until he was standing a few feet from the merchant. He held out a small, worn leather pouch. "You say your paper makes her your wife," Kohan said, his English precise and clear. "It is a legal document," Thorne said, regaining his composure, though a flicker of unease showed in his eyes. "A man buys a horse, he gets a bill of sale," Kohan continued, his voice calm and even. "He does not marry the horse. He owns it." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. It was a single, folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. "Your paper is a lie. This paper is the truth." He held it out. Thorne's face went pale. He recognized it instantly. Jack stepped forward and snatched the paper from Cohan's hand. He unfolded it. It was not a marriage certificate. It was a crudely written contract, a bill of sale, documenting the transfer of one girl, aged 16, sound of limb from her father to Elias Thorne in exchange for $200. It was the document that proved she had not been a bride, but a slave. Cohan must have taken it from the trafficker's camp, a piece of foresight that was as lethal to Thorne's claim as his tomahawk had been to Silas. "Let's take a ride into town," Jack said, his voice like ice. He looked at Thorne, a predatory smile on his face. "We're going to see the judge." The scene in the Redemption Courthouse was a tense, quiet affair. Judge Miller, a weary man who had seen every kind of frontier justice, read both documents in silence. The Abernathys and a few other townspeople stood in the back, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning shame. Thorne, stripped of his authority, sputtered about lies and forgeries, but the crude honesty of the bill of sale, combined with the silent, damning testimony of the scars Jack had insisted the judge see on Marion's back in private, sealed his fate. Judge Miller finally looked up, his gaze stern. "Mr. Thorne, this document," he said, holding up the marriage certificate, "is predicated on the notion of consent between two parties. This other document," he held up the bill of sale, "is evidence of human trafficking, a contract of slavery. It renders your marriage claim null and void. In the eyes of the law in this territory, Marion is not and has never been your wife." He slammed his gavel down on the desk. "She is a free woman." The words echoed in the small room. Asterisk, a free woman. Elias Thorne, facing potential charges and the cold reality that his power was meaningless here, fled the town with his men before the sun set. Marion stood outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun on her face. Jack was beside her, his hand holding hers. She looked up and saw Cohan standing across the street, watching them. Their eyes met. He had saved her 3 times, first from her chains, then from her enemies, and finally, from the law itself. He gave her a single, slow nod, a final acknowledgement, a final farewell. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dusty street. A spirit of the wild returning to his own world, his work here finally done. Marion squeezed Jack's hand, the tears in her eyes no longer for sorrow, but for a release so absolute it felt like being born again. The last chain had been broken. The judge's gavel had declared Marion a free woman, but the verdict of the town was far harsher. The law could break a paper chain, but it could not mend the iron bonds of prejudice. The story of the runaway bride, the Apache rescuer, and the violent end of her pursuers had twisted in the telling, becoming a lurid frontier tale. Marion was no longer seen as a victim, but as a dangerous woman, a creature of chaos trailed by blood and sin. The shunning was a quiet, suffocating thing. When Jack rode into Redemption for supplies, a silence fell over the general store. Men who had shared a drink with him for years suddenly found their boots fascinating. Women pulled their children closer, turning their backs as he passed. Mr. Abernathy, his face a tight mask of piety, informed him that the town council had awarded the beef contract for the coming year to a rival rancher. It was a crippling financial blow, but the deeper wound was the betrayal. Jack Calder, who had built his life on a foundation of respect and hard work, was now an outcast in the community he had helped establish. He bore it with a stoic, simmering rage, his silence more volcanic than any shout. But Marion saw the cost in the new lines etched around his eyes, in the way he stared out at the land he was in danger of losing. She was the cause. She was the disease. And he was the one suffering the symptoms. The peace they had found in each other's arms was now contained within the borders of the Triple C, an isolated island in a sea of hostility. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, she finally spoke the words that had been poisoning her heart. You should let me go, Jack. He turned to look at her, his face hard in the twilight. Don't ever say that. Look what I've brought you, she pleaded, her voice thick with a guilt that was a physical weight. They've taken your name, your friends, your business. I come with a curse. Everything I touch withers. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the porch boards. He paced back and forth, a caged lion, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was not angry at her, but at the injustice of it, at his own powerlessness against whispers and turned backs. Do you think I care about this town? He finally burst out, his voice a raw, furious growl. Do you think I give a damn about their contracts or their Sunday sermons? They took my wife. This land took my wife. I was already a ghost in this valley. I had nothing. He stopped in front of her, his large frame blocking out the last of the dying light. He dropped to his knees, taking her hands in his grip desperate. I've lost everything already. Marion, he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability she had never heard. You are the only thing I have left. His words were meant to bind her to him, but they felt like a final, terrible condemnation. She was not his salvation. She was the last remnant of his ruined life. To love him was to allow him to be destroyed. She knew, with a certainty that broke her heart, what she had to do. That night, she waited until the house was still, until his deep, steady breathing told her he was asleep. She dressed in her plainest clothes, took a small knife, a water skin, and the worn buffalo hide Kohan had first given her. She left the Apache necklace, the 3 smooth stones of farewell, on the pillow beside Jack's head. She took one last look at his sleeping face, a rugged landscape softened by dreams, and memorized it. Then she slipped out of the house, a ghost leaving a ghost behind, and walked back into the wilderness that had once been her prison, and was now her only refuge. She walked for days, heading for the high country, the dark, pine-choked mountains that loomed on the horizon. She survived on her own resilience, her senses sharpened by her time with Kohan. She found a long-abandoned trapper's cabin, a small, dilapidated lean-to tucked away in a hidden valley by a clear, cold stream. The roof leaked and the wind whistled through the chinks in the logs. But it was a shelter. Here, there were no judging eyes, no whispers. Here, she was not a curse. She was simply a woman, alone. Her days fell into a rhythm of survival. She gathered firewood, foraged for edible roots and berries, and set simple snares for rabbits. She learned the language of the forest, the calls of the birds, the tracks of the deer. She was living a solitary, almost feral existence, and in it, she found a strange, hollow peace. She was free from the world of men, but she was not free from the memory of Jack. One afternoon, as she was gathering medicinal herbs near the stream, she felt a presence. She looked up and saw Kohan standing on the opposite bank, watching her. He had appeared as he always did, without a sound, a piece of the ancient landscape made flesh. He waded through the stream, the cold water swirling around his legs, and stopped before her. He looked at her simple camp, at the quiet competence in her movements. You are a hunter now, he said. It was not a question. I am a survivor, she corrected softly. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw an understanding that went beyond words. He had known a loss that had hollowed out his world, just as hers had been. He is looking for you, Kohan said. The rancher, he rides the edge of the mountains every day. He calls your name until his voice is raw. A sharp pain lanced through Marion's heart. It is better this way. I bring him nothing but ruin. Kohan was silent for a long moment. He looked at the sky, at the towering pines, at the running water. The rope is cut, he said, his voice quiet but intense. The cage is broken. The law has set you free. He looked back at her. You are free from every chain, but one, the one you carry inside your own heart. He reached out and touched his finger to her chest. You are free, but you have not yet given yourself permission to love. He turned and walked back across the stream, disappearing into the forest as silently as he had arrived, leaving his words to echo in the valley. His wisdom settled in her soul. She was free, but she was still acting like a prisoner, sentencing herself to exile for crimes she did not commit. She loved Jack Calder. The realization was as terrifying and as essential as breathing. She could not go back to him, not while she was a danger to him, but she could no longer deny the truth of her own heart. She began to write. She had no paper, so she used strips of birch bark she peeled carefully from the trees. She had no ink, so she used charcoal from her fire, crushed and mixed with water. She wrote letters to Jack, letters she knew he would never see. She poured out everything, her fear, her guilt, her overwhelming love for him. She wrote about the way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, about the reassuring weight of his hand on her back, about the way he had kissed her scars and made her whole. When she finished a letter, she would walk the long miles to the edge of the forest that bordered the Triple C. There was a wide, flat river stone at a bend in the stream that marked his land. She would slip the fragile bark letter beneath it, a secret offering to a man she could not have. It was a hopeless, desperate ritual, but it kept her sane. It was the only way she could touch him. Jack, meanwhile, was falling apart. The ranch was running on the loyalty of his men, but its master was a hollowed-out shell. He rode the borders of his land relentlessly, his eyes scanning the dark, impassive line of the forest, his voice hoarse from calling her name. He found her tracks once, leading into the mountains, but they vanished on the rocky ground. He was a man adrift. One day, after weeks of this torment, he followed the stream that flowed down from the high country, a desperate last-ditch effort. As he rounded a bend, he saw it, a flat river stone that looked disturbed, acting on a pure, unthinking instinct. He dismounted, knelt, and lifted the stone. Beneath it lay a dozen fragile, curled pieces of birch bark, covered in faint black markings. He picked one up with trembling fingers. Asterisk, my dearest Jack. It began. He read her words, her love, her pain, her sacrifice. He read them all, a testament to a love so strong it had chosen to exile itself. He knew then where she was, and what he had to do. He followed the stream into the forest, not with the force of a man reclaiming his property, but with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. He did not go all the way to her hidden valley. He stopped at the edge of the woods, where the deep pines began. He fell to his knees in the soft pine needles, the man who had never knelt for anyone. He lifted his face to the silent, watching trees, and he begged. "Marian!" His voice was not a command, but a raw, broken plea. "I know you are here. I will not come any further. I will not force you. But please, if you will not come back, just let me know that you are alive. Leave a sign, anything, so I can live with knowing you are still in this world." The forest held its breath for a long moment, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the high pines. Jack remained on his knees, a statue of supplication, his heart a raw, open wound. He waited, for a sign, for a sound, for anything to break the crushing silence. He was about to give in to despair when a twig snapped in the undergrowth. He looked up, his heart seizing in his chest, and there she was. Marian stepped out from between two ancient ponderosa pines, a figure of impossible grace. She was thinner, her skin tanned by the sun, her movements possessing a new, quiet sureness. She was no longer a victim, no longer a refugee. She was a woman who had walked through the fire and made peace with the wilderness inside her. Around her neck, resting against the simple fabric of her dress, was the Apache necklace Kohan had left for her. The 3 dark stones lay against her collarbone, a testament to a journey that had required 2 different kinds of saviors. She walked toward him, her steps steady, Her eyes locked on his. She stopped just a few feet away, and the look on her face was not one of pity or guilt, but of a profound and settled love. "Get up, Jack," she said softly. He rose slowly, his legs unsteady, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. He looked like a man who had been offered a drink of water after a lifetime of thirst. "Marion," he breathed, her name a prayer. She closed the small distance between them and reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion and grief. "I heard you," she whispered. "Every day. I heard you." He pulled her to him then, not with the desperate force of a man reclaiming a possession, but with the reverence of a man welcoming home his own soul. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent of pine smoke and wild herbs. And for the first time since his first wife had died, Jack Calder wept. "I was saved twice," Marion said against his chest, her voice clear and strong. "One man cut the ropes from my wrists and gave me back my life. He saved me from the hell I was in." She pulled back slightly, her gaze holding his, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But only once was I loved the right way. Only one man ever saved me from the hell that was inside of me." There were no more words to be said. In that moment, the town, the gossip, the lost contracts, none of it mattered. He was hers, and she was his, and together, they would face whatever came. They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, two solitary figures returning from their separate wildernesses, finally finding their way home. Their wedding took place a week later. It was not held in the church in Redemption, with its pews of judging eyes. Instead, they stood on the porch of the main house at dawn, as the first rays of sunlight washed the sky in hues of rose and gold. The only guests were the half-dozen loyal hands of the Triple C, who stood awkwardly in their Sunday best, their hats clutched in their hands, their weathered faces beaming. A traveling preacher, a weary but kind man whom Jack had ridden 50 miles to fetch, read the simple vows. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jack did not kiss his bride with a triumphant passion. He held her face gently in his large, calloused hands, and touched his lips to hers with a tenderness that spoke of 1,000 nights of fear and loneliness finally laid to rest. In that kiss was a promise of safety, a vow of sanctuary, a quiet acknowledgement that their true marriage had begun long before these words were ever spoken. Life on the Triple C found a new center. The town of Redemption continued its shunning, but the ranch became a world unto itself, a thriving kingdom of two. But Marion was no longer content to simply be the mistress of the house. The healing she had received from Jack sparked a desire to become a healer herself. In her time in the mountains, she had learned much about herbs and natural remedies. She converted a small, unused storeroom into a clinic of sorts. She began to treat the ranch hands for their various injuries and ailments, her gentle touch and quiet competence earning her their undying devotion. Word of her skills, carried by itinerant cowboys and trappers, began to spread through the territory. Soon, people began to arrive at the Triple C, not the pious citizens of Redemption, but the outcasts, the poor, the desperate, a mother with a feverish child, a young cowboy with a badly broken leg, a family whose wagon had overturned. Marion turned no one away. She became a beacon of hope in a land that was often cruel and unforgiving. She took in 2 orphaned children whose parents had been lost to a cholera outbreak, and the main house, once a silent tomb of grief, was filled with the sound of laughter. One morning, Jack found an arrow, fletched with the feather of a golden eagle, embedded deep in the trunk of the massive cottonwood tree that marked the entrance to the ranch. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but he knew. It was Kohan's final message. It was a symbol of a warrior's watch, an acknowledgement that this home was now protected, that Marion's freedom was secure. Kohan had vanished back into the vast, silent land that had birthed him. His duty fulfilled, his spirit forever a part of the mountains that watched over the valley. On what they decided to call their wedding night, A full moon hung in the sky, bathing the prairie in a soft, ethereal silver light. The house was quiet, the children asleep. Jack came into their room and found Marion standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit world. She turned to him, a small, serene smile on her lips. She walked to him and took his hand, leading him to the bed. The night was not for a frantic, passionate release, but for a final, sacred sealing of their bond. She lay beside him, the moonlight tracing the network of old scars on her back. He began to kiss them, as he had done that first night. But this time it was not to erase the past, but to accept it, to honor the journey that had brought her to him. She stopped him, placing her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. She looked into his eyes, her own gaze clear and unwavering. "We were both chained." "Jack," she whispered, her voice a soft caress in the quiet room. "Me, by ropes and laws and the hands of cruel men. You, by a grief so deep it built a wall around your heart." She moved closer, her lips almost touching his ear. "But tonight, I choose to give you the key." The story ends there, but it also begins. It begins with the image of a man and a woman, riding their horses side by side across the vast, open grasslands of the Triple Sea. They ride into a blazing sunset, their long shadows stretching out behind them. In the distance, the rugged peaks of the Apache Mountains are set ablaze, bathed in a final, brilliant wash of golden light, standing as silent, eternal witnesses to a love that was forged in the wild, unforgiving heart of the West. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for tonight's tale. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with our community of fellow adventurers.